If you will, I'll have a few handouts here tonight, so if someone will please help me to pass these out, I would appreciate that. We're in Nehemiah chapter 7 tonight, if you'll be opening your Bible there. Nehemiah 7. Appreciate it. That's it.
I didn't want to help anyway.
Nehemiah chapter 7 is where we're going to camp this evening as we continue our study of this good book, thinking about how we can rise up and build up the church of Christ. We've been studying now for at least 3 weeks, the book of Nehemiah, 4 weeks, and we've been examining this book section by section, looking at what made these people successful as they sought to rise up and build. The city of Jerusalem was in a state of ruin at that point in time. The walls were broken down, the gates were broken down, and there was a need to revive those stones, rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And that's what's taking place in this book. We've been focusing upon a key word each time we've been studying together, looking at something that made them successful, a key word that captures what made these people successful. And we've been trying to make application to our lives, the local church at Eastern Meadows, as we can harness those same things and revive those same things so that we can be successful, because God indeed has work for us to do as well. Our word tonight, there in your handout, is the word preservation. Preservation. As we begin by setting the stage for our study, let's think about that word preservation and just kind of backtrack for a moment and think about what's happened in this book to set the stage for this chapter. By this time in the book of Nehemiah, the work on the walls of Jerusalem was completed. Notice in chapter 6, we finished up chapter 6 last week, but in chapter 6, verse 15, notice once again that Nehemiah says, "So the wall was finished in the 25th day, in 52 days." In 52 days, the work on those walls was completed. And so by this point in time, Nehemiah 7, the actual work on picking up those stones and lifting up those gates and lifting up those bars, that part of the work is finished. In Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2, our very first study, we talked about motivation. If we're going to be successful in rising up and building, we must be motivated. We must see the cause, and we must be extremely passionate about that cause. In Nehemiah 1 and 2, Nehemiah sees the need to act, and he motivates those around him to see the need to act as well. In chapter 2, they say, "Let us rise up and build." Then in chapter 3, we talked about the idea of cooperation. Nehemiah had a plan, and he puts forth this plan now, surrounding himself with people who will work the plan. He gives out the various responsibilities, the specific tasks and jobs, and each of these people in chapter 3 who were listed worked together. They were cooperating, doing their work in their specific role to carry out the work of God. We talked about last week from chapters 4, 5, and 6, the idea of determination. Satan was at work too. And every step of the way during this building process, Satan was trying to discourage the work, hinder the work, halt the work. And we talked about last week at least 9 things Satan did trying to discourage the work, but yet they were determined. They had grit and resolve, and they finished chapter 6, verse 15, the work on the walls. So as we move into the last part of the book, beginning here in chapter 7, there's still a lot of ground to cover, but the actual work on the walls has been completed. But I want us to realize as we study chapter 7 tonight that even though the work on the walls was completed, Nehemiah knew their work wasn't over. It's not time to sit back and relax. The work of God continues. Yes, the wall's been built. Yes, we now have gates to help us be secure. Yes, we have bars to help us be even more secure. But Nehemiah knows the work of God is not finished. Nehemiah knows now it's time to protect this work. Now it's time to preserve this work. Now it's time to put some things in place to guarantee that Jerusalem survives for many years to come. You see, Nehemiah knows that even though the gates and the walls, they're finished, a city is more than just gates and walls. A city is made up of people. And those people need to be organized. Those people need to be protected. Those people need to be encouraged to follow the Word of God. Those people in that city need to be encouraged to worship God and glorify God in God's prescribed ways. And so even though the walls are finished, the work is not finished. Now it's time to focus our attention on the people and organize the people and safeguard the work for the future. What good are walls and gates and bars without organization among the people? What good are gates without warriors to protect the city? What good would be the hard work that they have put into those walls without putting measures in place to help preserve and perpetuate that work throughout the coming years? And so beginning in chapter 7, throughout the end of this book, Nehemiah is in preservation mode. He's helping to organize the people and help to perpetuate Jerusalem for many generations to come. And it all begins right here in chapter 7. At least 3 things are done to preserve and perpetuate the work they put into God's cause. So let's define that word preservation to begin our study. As we set the stage and as we begin to get started this evening, let's define that word preservation. In your handout, one definition looks like this. It's the act of keeping something valued alive. The act of keeping something valued alive, intact, and free from damage or decay. Furthermore, to make lasting. So altogether, the act of keeping something valued alive, intact, free from damage or decay, to make lasting. And you think about that concept and all the parts of that definition, and some similar words, some synonyms we might say, would include maintaining what you have, perpetuating what you have, protecting what you have, upholding what you have. It's the idea of putting measures in place, doing things to guarantee that what you've done will last. And that's exactly what's happening in chapter 7. The walls are finished, but how are we going to guarantee that this city survives? How are we going to guarantee that Jerusalem, the people, continue to serve God and glorify God for generations to come? There has to be more than just walls, gates, and bars. And so this whole entire chapter, as we think about in a few moments, the 3 things that take place in the midst of these 73 verses and a bulk of this chapter, a long list of hard names to pronounce. As you and I think about these 3 things in just a few moments as we examine this text, in your mind tie it back to what's happening. Nehemiah has finished the work, but now he knows as a great leader, we must preserve it. We must perpetuate it. We must protect it. Do you think that is important for us today in the Lord's church? Do you think it's important for a local church to think about, as they seek to rise up and do the work of Christ, to not only have a mind on what they're doing right now, their work at hand, but also to have an eye on the future? and make sure that, yes, we're doing God's work today in 2018, but what about preserving and perpetuating and protecting this work and what we've worked so hard to accomplish for all the generations to come? For our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. That's what Nehemiah is doing. And dear friends, that's a vital part of a local church rising up and building. We must have an eye towards the future. We must be thinking about putting measures in place to prolong our existence and to preserve what we have sacrificed and worked so hard to do as a congregation. I want to share with you, as we think about these things, as we get started, some statistics. And I don't want to give these statistics to be a prophet of doom or a preacher of doom, anything like that, just to simply show you where we are as the church in this United States of America. In the 2018 edition of Churches of Christ in the United States, that's published by 21st Century Christians. It's pretty much a book that enumerates all the congregations of the Lord's Church in America. And in the 2018 edition, on page 22, these statistics are found. And I want you to think about this. As we think about perpetuating our existence, preserving our work, protecting our heritage, between the years 2000 and 2018, that's just 18 years, 1,047 congregations ceased to exist. In 18 years in the U.S., over 1,000 local churches closed their doors and ceased to exist as a local church. Furthermore, they say that's an average loss of 59 congregations per year. 59 churches per year. As far as people are concerned, that's a loss of 200,000 adherents. Dear friends, that's shocking. Whenever I read those statistics, I put those statistics down in writing so I would see that and be reminded of that, because it shocks me. It concerns me. In 18 years, 200,000 adherents are lost. 59 churches per year are gone. And dear friends, that's happening all throughout the U.S. Congregations that did much good for many years. They had many great victories and successes for Christ over their existence, but measures were not taken to prolong the work, to preserve the work, to guarantee and perpetuate that work. And thus they dwindled over the years, and their doors were closed, and they died off. Whenever I was in preaching school back in 2012, I went to a congregation Caitlin and I did one Sunday to preach, to fill in. I preached for a church the whole 2 years I was in preaching school, but beyond that, I would still travel occasionally for the school and fill in when needed and preach when needed. And we went on one occasion to a church, and I'm kidding you not, when we got there was no running water at the building. This is in 2012 and 13. There were about 4 or 5 people in the building, and I had to do virtually every act of worship that Sunday. And the thing is, it was not always that way. This is not a situation where a few individuals have banded together to start a church in this area. They're just now built this building. They can only afford this building, and they're trying to do the best they can. This is not the case at all. They've been there for many, many, many years. And they've dwindled and dwindled and dwindled and dwindled now to the point where it's just a handful. At least it was then. And not even able to afford running water in a bathroom. And dear friends, that's the case in many places. And that's what we must think about as we seek to rise up and build. Yes, we're trying to work now and work hard now and do the work of Christ now, but what are we doing to think about the future and make sure this congregation is still standing 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and all the things we've done and worked so hard to accomplish will not be for for nothing. But our work can be perpetuated and preserved. Nehemiah knows we can't stop right now. There's still so much work to do. We must put things in place to make sure this work has been for the glory of God and will remain that way for many years. And so with those thoughts in mind, let's think about this chapter. And as we think about these three things again, tie it all back in your mind to the idea of preservation. Any comments you want to make before we think about our examination of this passage? Anything you want to mention? Definitely, yes. Yes, the overall total has gone down. Yes. And that's what's shocking. We want the Lord's church to be growing. We want congregations to be being established and adherents to be added, not the opposite. That's why it's so important for us to think about things like this and do what they did, rise up and build. We've got so much work to do. And that's why this book is very important for us today. As we examine chapter 7, if you want to go ahead and jot down the 3 Roman numerals, notice number 1, the 3 things that happen in this chapter. Number 1, we have enlisted leadership. These are the measures that are taken to prolong the work and preserve the work. Number 1, enlisted leadership. Number 2, established citizenship. Established citizenship. And then number 3, encouraging giving. Enlisted leadership, established citizenship, encouraging giving. Notice first of all from verses 1 to 3, the first measure Nehemiah takes to perpetuate, prolong, and preserve this work is he enlists some leaders. He enlists some godly, qualified leaders. Somebody, if you will, read for us verses 1 to 3. Then we'll go back and look at them individually and make some observations about them. Nehemiah 7, verses 1, 2, and 3. All right, Nehemiah was an outstanding leader. We've talked about that, and we could say a lot about that. But Nehemiah knows to prolong the work, to perpetuate the work, it can't be just Nehemiah. Nehemiah knows he can't do this work alone, and even if he could, he's not going to be around forever. He has to appoint and enlist some leaders to help him share the load and help to preserve the work. And so that's what he does in the first 3 verses. Once the work's completed, now he enlists some helpers, enlists some leaders to help perpetuate the work. The first group is he selects 2 assistants. He selects 2 assistants. That's in verse number 2. Verse 2 notes how he chose Hanani and Hananiah to be the ones in charge over Jerusalem. As far as these 2 individuals were concerned, Hanani was Nehemiah's brother, the text points out. And if you think back in chapter 1, it was this individual who brought to Nehemiah the alarming news of Jerusalem's state. He came to visit Nehemiah, and Nehemiah asked, "How is Jerusalem? How are my brethren doing?" And he gives that alarming report that sparks Nehemiah's desire to build the walls of Jerusalem. So this individual is mentioned again, and now Nehemiah says, "I put him and Hananiah, the ruler of the palace, charge over Jerusalem." He selects these two assistants to help him rule over, organize over Jerusalem. Now, the reason why he chose these two people above others is listed there in the verse. These people were qualified for the job. He put the right people in the right places at the right time for the right job. And now he puts these two people in this position of leadership because of two qualities. One is they were faithful, and the second is that they feared God. That's again mentioned in verse number 2. It is important whenever leaders are appointed and selected that qualified, competent leaders be selected and appointed. It's also important for men who are qualified, men who are good, godly leaders, to step up and be willing to lead in those capacities. Because oftentimes what happens in the opposite case, when you have qualified men who will not step up and lead, oftentimes those who are not qualified are more than willing to step up and lead. But no doubt these two individuals had a great desire to serve God and advance the cause of God and help the people of God. They were faithful to God's cause. They were reliable, dependable men. They feared God. They revered God's word. And Nehemiah knows they're qualified for the job. So he selects two assistants. Number 2, he chooses gatekeepers. He chooses gatekeepers. If you back up to verse number 1, the Bible reads that Nehemiah had set up doors. When those doors were set up, he put porters and singers and the Levites to be gatekeepers. The idea of porters there, these were individuals who would be watchmen, we might say. They would watch over, they would guard the gates of Jerusalem. You recall back in chapter 3, all the various gates that were around the city of Jerusalem are mentioned. And they're mentioned in such an interesting way as the work is done before our very eyes in Nehemiah chapter 3. But each of those gates could not stand alone. There was a need for a gatekeeper. What's the purpose of a gate without a gatekeeper? To make sure and take care of who comes in and who comes out. It's interesting to me that in ancient times, such as like with the Great Wall of China, every time in history when the Great Wall of China was penetrated by the enemy, at least 4 times history records, in each of those occurrences, the watchers and the guards had been bribed. And so Nehemiah knows we need some guards, and he puts these porters in place to be the watchers, to be the guard, and no doubt these individuals also were qualified, competent, reliable people, fit for the job. Notice in verse number 3 the instructions Nehemiah gives to these watchers over the gates. He tells them in verse 3 to let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun be hot. In ancient times, it was customary to open the gates of a city at sunrise. That was the custom of the day, but Nehemiah says don't do that. He advises against that. He's put these watchers in place, but now he says, don't do what is normally done. Instead, you wait until the sun is hot to open up the gates. In other words, you wait until the sun has already risen and the day has well started. The people are up and about. They're not still sleeping and vulnerable. This was a time when God's people had many enemies who were trying to attack them and discourage the work. And he knows that we must be vigilant. So some interesting instructions there. You wait until the sun is hot. But the point is, here's some leaders he's enlisted. Also, number 3, Nehemiah appoints guards. He appoints guards. 2 assistants, gatekeepers to stand at each gate and watch over the gates, who's coming in, who's going out. And also, now he appoints some guards. In verse 3, The text reads that he appointed watches of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, everyone in his watch, and everyone to be over against his house. These watchers would patrol around the city and help guard the city in that fashion, but also he put strategic people at strategic places, vulnerable places, to help keep a watch in those areas. And the text reveals he puts these watchers where they're watching in relation to their own house. You recall back in chapter 3 again, whenever Nehemiah had those workers working his plan, the text reveals numerous times, at least 6 times, that he put workers working by their house. But now he puts watchers watching by their house. Let us be impressed in these first 3 verses that the first thing Nehemiah does, as he seeks to advance this work, perpetuate this work, preserve Jerusalem, is we must make sure we have qualified, competent leaders in place. Do you think there's application there as far as thinking about prolonging and preserving local congregations, protecting their work for the future, making sure the torch is passed from qualified leader to the new generation of qualified leader, to make sure the church continually has competent, reliable, qualified, faithful, godly leaders? Of course there is. The fact that Nehemiah began this preserving process by appointing qualified leaders is not incidental. If the local church is going to be active in preserving their work, they will also be active in nurturing and developing leadership. It impresses me when local churches do that. When they have training classes for young men. When they're working with young men to teach them how to lead in worship. To teach them how to be leaders. When the elders are grooming certain men to one day be future elders and future deacons. They're giving them assignments and responsibilities and watching them work and watching their strengths grow. They're nurturing, developing leaders for the future because they understand we can't do this alone. And even if we could, we're not going to be here forever. The torch has to be passed. And that's what Nehemiah's doing. He's enlisting leadership. It saddens me to see local churches who have great leaders. But yet their leaders are aged men, their health is declining, and as they look around those twilight years and wish to pass the torch of leadership, they look around and in disbelief there's no one to take their place. This is a vital part of preserving our work for the future. Any comments about that? Anything you want to mention about that? I don't want to hog the class if you have a comment to share. If not, let's move forward in our study and examine number 2, the second thing that Nehemiah does to help perpetuate and advance the work for generations to come. He's established some leaders now, but now in verses 4 to 69, a large part of this chapter, we have established citizenship. If you read this chapter, then you understand that there are a lot of names in Nehemiah chapter 7. There's 73 verses in this chapter, a long chapter. And a lot of these 73 verses, it's a list of names, much like in chapter 3. But in this case, it's not a list of workers, it's a list of inhabitants. It's a list of people who are dwelling and families who are dwelling in Jerusalem. In verses 4 to 69, Nehemiah does 2 things. He takes a census and he examines a record, a genealogy. And the reason why he does that is pretty much twofold. And we're going to make some application as we think about this because we're not going to go back and look at all of these names and make application from the names. I want to think about this from a broad perspective. Why is Nehemiah doing this? Why is it important to take a census and then examine a genealogy? Number 1, there was a need to develop Jerusalem. Jerusalem needs to be developed. Somebody, if you will, look at verse number 4 and read verse 4 for our class.
The city was wide and large, but the people within few, and no houses had been rebuilt.
All right, so Nehemiah looks around and he sees that Jerusalem covers a large area on the map. But as he looks at all the surface area of Jerusalem, there's many areas that are not yet developed. You know what's happened years ago? We talked about that. A destruction, punishment happened. The forces of Babylon came in and broke down the walls, broke down houses, burned the gates, broke down the temple. And still, even in Nehemiah's day, Nehemiah sees Jerusalem needs to be developed. There's still developing to take place. And that's an alarming thing in his mind. There's houses that need to be built, area to be developed. And so it was important as he begins to do that to have a record in his mind of how many inhabitants we have. That's a good place to begin. If we're going to develop this city, if we're going to develop parts that are not yet developed in this city, we must understand the number of inhabitants that we have. And so he calls all the people together. He calls these nobles together in verse number 5 and takes the census. He, in verse number 5, finds the register, the one that is written in Ezra chapter 2, of the inhabitants that came back. And in light of those things, gives us an account of those who were there in Jerusalem at this point in time. It's a very small number. And so a need is to develop Jerusalem. But a second reason why it's important at this juncture to take a census and look at the record is not just to develop Jerusalem, but there was a need for these Jews to confirm their heritage. A need to confirm their heritage. In America, we have cities that are melting pots. We have people from all over. We have all different kind of cultures, all different backgrounds. But that was not the case in Jerusalem. This is God's city. This is the holy city. And to be in the city, you would want to be a Jew and know that you're a Jew. Be able to prove that you're a Jew and be proud that you are a Jew. And so it was a need as they're seeking to now organize the people and focus on not just the walls, but the city itself, the people, to understand how many people we actually have and really be able to trace our heritage back and confirm that we are indeed true fleshly Jews. In the case of some, if we drop down to verses 61 to 65, some of the priests are mentioned, and in addition to them, some others are mentioned. And notice in verse number 64 what the text reads. The Bible said, these saw their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but it was not found. Therefore were they, as polluted, put from the priesthood. There's a need to confirm their heritage, and in the case of some, they couldn't do that. And it was very troubling. In the case of these priests, it hindered them from being able to enter the temple and execute their priestly duties. So because of those two reasons, let's develop Jerusalem some more. And to do that, we must know how many we have, but also a need to confirm our heritage. In this record here, there's at least 4 different categories of people who are cited. In verses 6 and 7, you have the original leaders who returned way back with Zerubbabel. That's verses 6 and 7. In verses 8 to 38, you have various families or clans of people who are mentioned in this record. In verses 39 to 60, you have the temple personnel, various categories of the temple personnel. Then, as we mentioned a second ago, in verses 61 to 65, you have some people in this record who had questionable ancestry. They couldn't prove their heritage. And that was troubling to them. And even this record, Nehemiah takes notice in verses 68 and 69, the number of animals they had. And so it's exhaustive, it's an intensive record, and the census has taken place to help establish citizenship, to see what we've got and what we can do. So what's the takeaway from all that? What's the application in light of all that? At least one of the things I can think of as we look for some application in what Nehemiah is doing, people are important. People are important. You see, the walls were important, but what's even more important is the people. In Nehemiah chapter 3, an entire list of workers, people, is mentioned. People by name. And now in chapter 7, so important to the work of perpetuating Jerusalem, again, people are mentioned. You see, you and I are important. We are important as people, as individuals, to help perpetuate the work of the Lord, to help perpetuate the cause of God today. Notice then very quickly as we finish up our class tonight, our third Roman numeral, a third thing that happens in this chapter to help preserve the work and perpetuate the work is encouraging giving. Enlisted leadership, he enlists some leaders to help perpetuate the work. He gives a record and census to help establish citizenship to perpetuate the work. And now, as the chapter ends, in verses 70 to 73, we have encouraging giving. The term gave is used 3 times in connection to 3 groups who gave to support the temple ministry at the end of this chapter. In verse 70, the Word of God says the chief of the fathers gave, the Jewish leaders, they gave. Also in that verse, you have an interesting word, the Tershatha gave, or the governor gave. And so the chief leaders gave, then the governor gave, but also in the text, the Word of God reads that the people gave. Evidently, if we had time to examine this in more detail, when they left captivity, God had blessed these people. They left captivity, some of them did very wealthy. The text reads there in verse number 70 that those people gave 1,000 drams. That's about 19 pounds of gold they gave. 20,000 drams is mentioned in verses 71 to 72. That's about 375 pounds of gold. These people gave. They gave to support a cause. That cause was the temple ministry. And they gave in an abundant way to support that cause. As we think about perpetuating our work, preserving our work for the generations to come, yes, we must have godly leaders to pass the torch. Yes, we must have people because people are important to the work of God. We're all important. But we must also have people who are generous in their giving, who will reach deep in their pocketbooks out of the abundant blessings God's given to them and give to God's cause to help advance that cause and perpetuate that cause in generations to come. What a beautiful way to close out the chapter. But as we keep on studying in the chapters ahead, this work of preserving Jerusalem continues, but from different perspectives. So we'll come back next week and examine chapter 8. I appreciate you being here this evening. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you following along. And I look forward to our time next week as we pick back up in Nehemiah chapter 8. We'll be dismissed into our devotional thoughts.